So, who remembers the main subject of last week? Almost said month. Last week. What was the subject of last week? Virgin birth, right. So the reason that we're looking at virgin birth is because we're looking at myths versus Christ. Because there is a school of thought. It's prolific right now throughout the internet. All you have to do is type in myth versus Jesus, right? We like using verses. So myth versus Jesus. And you'll find many, many articles linking Jesus to Horus, to Mithras, to Zoroaster, just saying that Jesus is basically just the next iteration of a myth that's recycled throughout civilization, throughout history. We've pretty much gone through and shown, for the most part, how that's not true. In order, for example, for Horus, which is our favorite one, we watched the little 10-minute video. In order for the Horus myth to work, to match up, you have to take from little bits and pieces from 4 or 5 different Horus myths and put them into one cohesive linear understanding for it to even work. The Jewish people wouldn't have even had access to that historical record of all of the different Horus myths to be able to pick and choose those different things. So that just doesn't make sense. Last week we spent opportunity to look at the virgin birth in particular in the New Testament. You'll remember we had the mic going in and out and all that fun stuff. So we looked at the New Testament. We looked at specifically the arguments that the virgin birth is not real. And the reason the virgin birth is not real is because, well, Paul didn't talk about it. That's the big one, right? And only 2 of the 4 Gospels speak about it. So obviously, you can't, it must not have really happened, because it obviously wasn't that important. We look specifically at Paul's writings, and we see, even though he doesn't say the words virgin birth, through his writings and understanding of Jesus being a new Adam, there has to be that understanding that Christ did not come through Adam's lineage, meaning that he did not come from a human father. Because if he did, he could not fulfill that new Adam role. But in order for him to be human, in order for him to be 100% man, he had to come as a real human being through the birthing process. And that is why God didn't just form a new ball of clay, which we've got tons of it back here. New ball of clay, breathe life into it and say, okay, you're the new Adam, Jesus, take care of him. He brought Jesus in through our natural processes. And we talked also about the fact that though man at this point in time can create the virgin birth, that we perform surgery, we collect samples, we freeze things in nitroglycerin, nitrogen, my bad. It's an explosive area of science. We freeze things in nitrogen, we bring things together, and once the eggs have been fertilized with the sperm, we implant multiple eggs back into the woman once we've taken all that out. And that's why most people who go through the fertility process and go through the artificial insemination are likely to have multiple births. The most popular in recent history would be the octomom, right? Process of in vitro fertilization. So, and it is ludicrous to believe that man can do that, even though we have to go through all this complicated process, and that God would not be able to create sperm and fertilize an egg in utero without having to remove all of that and go through the process that man has to do. Because quite honestly, if man can do it, can God not do it better? Seriously. It just makes sense. Well, I could talk all day about that, but let's continue on. So we talked about the New Testament. Paul, in order for his concept of New Adam to work, had to be a virgin birth. He doesn't need to speak about it because it's common knowledge. It's already understood. The fact that only 2 of the 4 Gospels talk about virgin birth. Again, it's already understood. If we remember when we looked at the cohesiveness of the Gospels, we talked about the fact that they come from different perspectives. They don't all tell the same story from the same point of view. So why would we expect them to all hit on, oh, well, Jesus was born of a virgin? It just doesn't make sense. So, if we take what we see in the New Testament and we say, well, no, virgin birth based on the New Testament had to have taken place. It is pivotal, it is key, it is information that we must accept as true. Then what happens? Since you have accepted that the New Testament is true, and you have accepted that the story of Jesus is historically accurate and is true, then people who will argue against you will say, well, that's great, and the Gospels may say that, and Paul may have maybe talked about it by saying that he's a new Adam, but that's not Old Testament accurate. When I say Old Testament accurate, do you know where Matthew points to in the Scriptures to get tie this concept of virgin birth together? Where does he pull that information from?
Isaiah.
She was going to say, she was like, and you were Isaiah. So, yes, Isaiah. He pulls this from Isaiah, and so they will say, well, if you look at Isaiah, particularly in chapter 7, verse 14, Isaiah really didn't say virgin there. They used a word that means maiden, but it doesn't necessarily mean virgin. So since it doesn't necessarily mean virgin, obviously you're wrong. Because if they meant virgin, they would have used a particular word. So this is just Christians rewriting the Jewish scriptures so that it meets their narrative and it fits their needs. So today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Isaiah and we're going to do a book study. But we're going to concentrate on a couple of different words. So, how many of you have an exhaustive Strong's Concordance at home?
In my computers.
Right. If you do not have one, and trust me, you would know, it is a big book. It's about 4 inches thick. It probably weighs a good 50 pounds. Do you have one, John? 15. Well, if you carry a couple of them, maybe. It's a big book, though. And if any of you doubt my, maybe I'm being slightly hyperbolic, but I'll bring mine so you can lift it. You can tell for yourself. How's that? All right, so, because I actually have one. It's the abridged version, too, which is weird. Anyways, so, there's a couple of different words here, and we're going to look at their meanings in the original language and then in the Greek, because language study time. So, as always, I will remind you that I do not speak Hebrew, nor do I speak Greek. So, that's why we're going to spell everything. So, the 2 words that we're looking at is Alma, which is A-L-M-A-H. And this is the word that is actually used in Isaiah 7:14. It is used for a grand total of 7 times in the Old Testament. Of those 7 times, it is translated as maiden, or maidens even, 4 times, as girl once, as maid once, and virgin once. So let's just talk about that for a minute. So the Hebrew word is alma in Isaiah 7:14, and its inherent meaning is basically akin to young woman. Now, there is the understanding in Hebrew culture that any young unmarried woman is assumed to be a virgin. That's, well, let's just say you don't mess around if you're a Hebrew woman and you're not married. And if you do, there is a particular other word that is used for you. But it is not alma. So though the word itself does not necessarily imply virginity, alma does occur 7 times in the Scripture, and it is always used in the context of a young maiden or virgin or young unmarried woman. There is no conclusive evidence one way or the other for us to take that word out of context with no other words attached to it and say, well, this obviously only means virgin, or this only means young maiden. Now, the reason that I'm specifying that there is no way for us to take that word completely out of context is, how is the Hebrew text originally written? No vowels, all consonants, right? So you gain the vowels by understanding the context of the words around it and what you are trying to get at. So this is important to understand. It's important to understand that you cannot simply just remove the word and define it necessarily as you would today. If you were to look at it in writing, it could have other meanings depending on what vowels that you attach to it. Now, some do say that this is merely the feminine of the word elem, E-L-E-M, and elem just means young man. It doesn't necessarily mean a virgin young man. But I would also point out that they didn't often refer to young men as virgin, and they were not required to provide proof that they were virgins before they were married. Hebrew culture. Now, though alma is not used very frequently, again, it's only in there 7 times, right? It is used primarily to denote someone who is young, either never married or just married. So basically what we get from this conclusively is that it is a young Jewish woman of marriageable age that is presumed to be chaste. That means hasn't had sex. Right? This brings us to our second word. There is another word that the prophet Isaiah could have chosen to put in there if he wanted specifically to denote virgin. But there are some issues with it. This word is betula. B-E-T-U-L-A-H. Betula. Of course, again, I'm anglicizing it. And there was not enough in it. But, well, anyway. So, betula, did you guys want the Strong's numbers for these? Okay. Because alma is 5959. And betula is 1330. So, betula is found, 50 times. Betula is always, 32 times it is used to denote virgin, 17 times virgins, plural, and 1 time used for maiden. It is the more common way for someone to refer to a woman who has never been with a man, both in the biblical and modern Hebrew sense. But there are two types, the true virgin and the betrothed virgin, Betula Mor Harasha. That was probably the best that'll ever get. So, the betrothed virgin is basically generally considered the wife of a man, and the state of being betrothed to them is just as serious as a married state. So if you're betrothed to someone, it's taken in the Hebrew culture just as serious as if you were married to somebody. Make sense? All right. The word betula is commonly understood as virgin, but it's not very precise in that. Young, unmarried woman is as close as it gets. In Joel, they present an example of the word betula in a context that doesn't convey the usual meaning of virginity. It basically says that you will mourn like virgins in sackcloth, grieving for the husband of your youth. So it is used definitely as someone who has been married, but is mourning for the loss of their spouse. Even if Isaiah used the word betula, there could be the understanding that it was not someone who had never had sexual relations with a man, because the word itself is not precise. So there's a couple of different words that could be used, and the claim is that Isaiah was just saying that this was a young maiden and not a virgin. So, obviously, Christians must have changed the understanding of it so that it would fit the narrative that they wanted to speak into. That would be all fine and good and even possibly partially provable if it wasn't for the fact that in the 3rd century BC, it was not a group of Christians that came together, but a group of Hebrew authors that came together, scholars, Jewish rabbis. They began the process of translating the Hebrew scriptures into the Septuagint, right? Into Greek. The Septuagint is what came out of that. So this, what's that? 3 BC. 3 BC. This is before Christ, before the whole Christian movement. Hebrew scholars, rabbis, they came together and they translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, which gave us the Septuagint. Septuagint was widely accepted. That is what our New Testament authors quote from when they're talking about the Scriptures. And when they went through and they translated this particular passage in Isaiah, they were very particular in the word that they used. They used the Greek word for virgin, which is parthenos. Parthenos. It is not the more generic word for young woman. So 200 years before the birth of Christ, with no inherent belief in a virgin birth, translated Alma in Isaiah 7:14 as virgin and not young woman. So this gives us evidence that virgin is the most likely meaning of the term. The fact that this wasn't Christians who wrote this. Are you guys still awake? This is fascinating stuff.
Can you spell that word again?
You're talking about Parthenos?
Yeah.
Parthenos, which is specifically the Greek word for virgin. I do not have the strong reference for that. Yes? Huh? It has the same, Greek root structure of that, but I'm not sure exactly.
Yes.
Josh says yes. His Greek is much stronger than mine. So if we look at the Septuagint translation of Alma by by the rabbis and the Hebrew scholars, it leads to an understanding that what Isaiah was speaking of was a virgin birth, which basically totally denies the possibility that Christians have since changed it, because you can go now to the Jewish scripture and you can see Isaiah and understand that to be the virgin birth. Therefore, the New Testament of Alma as virgin in Isaiah 14, I say New Testament because this is Matthew pulling from Isaiah 7:14, rests on a Jewish understanding and interpretation of what Isaiah was saying. It does not rest on Christian understanding of what the word was. In fact, the fact that Matthew has quoted this specifically is, well, a bunch of... We actually have it like there. This word is on clay tablet in Scripture. So it's not, like a piece of papyrus or paper or whatever. Carved into a clay tablet is Isaiah 7:14 in Septuagint form, saying specifically virgin birth. So, there are a couple of different people who have looked at this, and there are, I think we should listen to what they have to say here. There is Dr. Cyrus Gordon. He provides some insights. He said, the commonly held view that virgin is Christian, whereas young woman is Jewish, is not quite true. The fact is that the Septuagint, which the Jewish translation made in pre-Christian Alexandria, takes Alma to mean virgin, means that the Jewish interpretation comes before the New Testament interpretation and rendering of Alma as virgin. So it rests precisely on Jewish interpretation and is not borne out of Christian scholars being hard-pressed to deny what the term is. So, Christian scholars couldn't look at the word Parthenos and say, well, it just means young lady, because Parthenos is specific to virgin. There's also J. Gresham Machen. He has done a definitive study of the passage and asserts that the translation in the Septuagint of the Hebrew word Alma as Parthenos cannot be used to show a Jewish doctrine of the virgin birth, for one also finds the word Parthenos used in the Septuagint to translate to the word Na'ara, which merely means young girl. But for Machen, the very fact that the passage does not have a history of Jewish messianic interpretation and the very unlikelihood that it is being interpreted messianically makes the New Testament account all the more credible. So the fact that this wasn't, before Matthew bringing this passage out, seen as a messianic prophecy, brings more credence to Matthew's claim of Jesus being born of a virgin birth and Isaiah 7:14 speaking to it. You're all awake still? Now I've given you all the facts. So if we look back in all of the references we have available, what we've looked at this month is that there is credence to who Jesus is, an understanding of who Jesus is, even if we look outside of the Scriptures. We went through several different historians that wrote about Jesus, and some that even specifically were trying to dispel the person of Jesus, and in doing so led credence to the fact that this was a real man in real time and real space that did exist. Last week, with the beginning of looking at virgin birth, we looked at the Gospels and we looked at Paul's writings to determine that there was a common understanding of the virgin birth. And today we have looked at the understanding of Isaiah 7:14 that Matthew uses to point to the virgin birth in the Gospels to say it's not just a Christian fantasy that was made up. It's not a word that was mistranslated by Christians, that was rewritten by Christians in order to fit their narrative. In fact, Isaiah 7:14 was translated by Hebrew scholars, Jewish rabbis, specifically to read virgin birth. Now, why is it important that we spend this entire month talking about these things? When you go out on the street today, when you go out to lunch or whatever it is you do afterwards, are you going to get into a debate with someone about Christ being Horus or Osiris? Adam will. Are any of you planning on having that debate today? It may leave you thinking, well, that's great that we discussed all this stuff. We have this scholarly understanding, James, but it has no practical use. And unfortunately, I have to inform you that there is practical use. This is something that's not just in the fringes. It's important that we talk about these things. See, I'm now leaving the subject of virgin birth because I believe that we have proven that there is concrete evidence for the virgin birth of Christ, which leads credence to the fact that Christ is not a myth, which leads credence to the understanding that this is a real person that came in real time and real space. He's not a repeating myth that started with Horus or even before Horus. He's not Mithras. He's not any of these other people. He is the Son of God. The reason that we have to look at this is because this is something that does come up whether we understand it to or not. There is, give me just a moment to pull up my reference. There is an article on CNN.com that was reposted on the 7th of this month, in fact. So I'm just going to read this article for you. The title of the article is Decoding Jesus, Separating Man from Myth. And this is reposted March 7th, 2017 on CNN.com. It was originally published in 2012. And it starts, Timothy Freak was flipping through an old academic book when he came across a religious image that some would call obscene. It was a drawing of a naked man, 3rd century amulet depicting a naked man nailed to a cross. This man was born of a virgin, preached about being born again, and had risen from the dead after crucifixion, says Freak. But the name on the amulet isn't Jesus, it's a pseudonym for Osiris or Dionysus. A pagan god in ancient Mediterranean culture, Freak says the amulet was evidence of something that sounds like sacrilege. Some would say that it is, that Jesus never existed. He was a myth created by our 1st century Jews who modeled him after other dying and resurrected pagan gods. Freaky is the author of The Jesus Mysteries. Was the original Jesus a pagan god? It goes on to talk about the fact that there are other people who believe this. And, of course, it also defends, so it has both sides. Freaky goes on to say, if I said to you that there was no real good Samaritan, I don't think anyone would be outraged. But there's the understanding that it is a teaching story. What we are saying is that Jesus' story is just an allegory. It is a parable of a spiritual journey. If you remove the physicality of Jesus, Paul still has his visions. Stephen can still die, being stoned to death, merely on those visions. So what they're saying is, Paul was able to be converted from killing Christians to a Christian himself because just having a vision of this mythical Jesus is a strong enough religious experience. That Stephen was stoned for not denying the person of Jesus simply based on a vision of this myth that never really existed. The article goes on to talk about, let me see if I can find his name here. There we go. Dr. Robert Price, a former Baptist pastor who argues in his book Deconstructing Jesus that a historical Jesus did not exist. People call me a bitter ex-fundamentalist. It's pathetic to see them assassinate my character like this. That's just what people resort to when they don't have solid arguments. We've just spent the past month talking about solid arguments for this. But the truth of the matter is, most people who claim to be Christians do not look at this type of stuff. They do not study, they do not understand it. They take it for what their pastor says. We want you to go beyond that. We want you to have that understanding so that you can truly be grounded. You can truly be faithful, knowing that you're not believing in a peg suspended in midair. There is substance there. There is truth there. This is an article on CNN.com. This is a news source that people go to on a regular basis. The article does go on to show the opposite side. It does talk about people that will debunk what Freak, or Freaky, however you pronounce his name, and Dr. Robert Price have to say. But they're not the only ones. There was one rebuttal that I found fascinating because it was Dr. Ehrman. And that's quite fascinating. Josh, why would it be fascinating that Dr. Ehrman would have anything to debunk the people who are denying the historic accuracy of Jesus?
Because Dr. Ehrman is the foremost anti-Christian scholar of antiquity. And actually, I posted the link to him actually talking about it. It's a good 4-minute clip where he's debating, I can't remember who it is, but he's debating, some guy. And it's a 4-minute clip where he goes on and on about the ridiculousness of the position that Jesus didn't exist and that these things weren't believed about him. He doesn't personally believe that they can be proven, which is why he's a cynic. But the idea that Jesus wasn't a historical character and these things weren't believed about him, that the first century church did not believe these things, he can't, as a scholar, stomach. So he is forced to, in his scholarship, argue for Christianity in this regard, even though he personally is a cynic about Christianity.
Yeah.
I
So,
also want to point out Robert Price.
yes.
Robert Price. He's so many videos with Robert Price talking about it. And I'll post a link to it. There's a particularly good, on Slack, there's a particularly good debate with James White and Dan Parker, where Dan Parker tries to talk about Mithras and Osiris and all of these things, and James White just shuts him down.
So the reason that I point to Josh here to point that out, there's a couple of different things. Slack is available, and it does have links to a bunch of videos. It has links to debates by James White, and there's clips of videos and that type of thing. Josh will post those links to you for you to have access to as well. So Ehrman has literally written a book arguing that virtually half of the New Testament is forged. And he will go on to tell you that the belief that the historical Jesus didn't exist is ludicrous. So, I wanted to point that out real quick. This article, I can also post a link to it for you. It's on CNN.com, and it's literally called Decoding Jesus, Separating Man from Myth. So, this is why we go over this. This is a subject that, believe it or not, is debated on a regular basis. I know not all of you are on Reddit. Not all of you are on, on the message boards or other things. I know you don't look at the same stuff that I do on a daily basis because it's not your task. Yes, Marianne.
I think I've seen that listed on TV on either the History Channel or OTV or.
There is a program called Decoding Jesus, but it's not the same as the article there. It goes on a different vein than that. So, but there are a ton of resources for you. There is a bunch of stuff that is literally easy to find all over the internet that will argue for the fact that Jesus is myth, when it is quite clear that he's not, just based on what we've talked about this month. And I've only spent literally, a couple hours over 4 days talking to you about this, but we could spend hours talking about how these things don't match up. So arm yourself, prepare yourself, educate yourself so that this type of thing doesn't sway you. I gave a statistic my first Sunday this month. I gave a statistic that had to do with kids from Christian homes going away to college. Does anybody remember what that statistic was? 85. 85. Now, there was a follow-up to that saying that most of that 85% is presumed to just be taking a break, but there hasn't been a conclusive long-term study of that. But 85% of young adults from Christian homes, when they go to college, no longer attend church. They're done. A lot of that is attributed to the fact that we as parents do not prepare them to apologize for their faith, to understand how to combat these ideas that are thrown at them. Any comparative religion class in any college is going to give ideas that will literally say Christians are dumb. We need to prepare our children for that, so that when they're told that their Savior is a myth, they know better. They don't have to doubt because they haven't been prepared. And when they come to you because they can't answer these questions, you'll be able to give them something that's substantial. It's very real, it's very serious. So, I only have one question for you, and then we'll break into our cell groups. After this month, I really want to know and discuss your take, your understanding of Jesus versus myth. How does that change your walk with Christ? That's it. Let's go to our cell groups and discuss.